milk, sugar, murder. Welcome, dear listeners, to Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Ailey, and I want to begin by saying how truly grateful I am for each of you who chooses to spend your time here. It warms my heart to know that these stories bring comfort and joy to such a wonderful community of listeners. Preparing every mystery takes time and care, but seeing how much you enjoy them makes it all worthwhile. It means the world to me that our little community continues to grow, and I'm delighted that so many of you are part of it. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. It helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more stories to enjoy together. Now, let us step quietly into tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. Milk at First Light. The first pale fingers of dawn were creeping across the village of St. Mary Me when Henry Larch pushed open the heavy wooden door of Meadow Dairy. February mornings were cruel things, bitter and damp, with a mist that clung to the cobblestones of the high street like a shroud. But Henry had been rising before the sun for 30 years, and his hands moved with practiced certainty as he struck a match and lit the oil lamp that would guide him through the morning's work. The dairy was a modest establishment, tucked between Mrs. Carmichael's haberdashery and the narrow lane that led to the church. Its cream-painted walls bore the honest patina of years, and the wooden floors, scrubbed clean each evening, gleamed dully in the lamplight. The sweet, rich smell of fresh milk hung in the air, mingling with the metallic scent of the churns and the faint mustiness that seemed to inhabit all old buildings in English villages. Henry was a careful man, methodical in all his ways. His neighbors often remarked upon the excellence of his cream line, and indeed there was something almost artistic in the way the thick cream rose to the top of his bottles, forming a perfect golden layer that spoke of quality and care. He took pride in his work, as his father had before him, and his father's father before that. The Larch family had been providing milk to St. Mary Me for 3 generations, and Henry intended that the tradition should continue. This morning, however, Henry was not alone in his early labors. His son Ben, a cheerful young man of 25, with sandy hair and quick, capable hands, was already moving about the loading area with the efficiency that came naturally to him. Ben had taken to the dairy business like a duck to water, as Henry's wife had often observed before her death 2 winters past. The boy had a head for figures and a way with the customers that Henry, for all his skill with milk and cream, had never quite possessed. "Morning." "Dad!" Ben called out as Henry entered, his breath visible in the cold air. "I've got the float nearly loaded. Mrs. Henderson's wanting an extra pint today. Her sister's visiting from London." Henry nodded approvingly. Ben kept careful track of such things, noting every variation in their customers' orders in the neat, leather-bound ledger that lived on the shelf beside the cash box. It was attention to detail like this that kept a small dairy competitive, especially with the larger concerns beginning to make inroads even into villages as traditional as St. Mary Me. The electric milk float stood ready outside, its batteries charged, and its cargo area systematically arranged with crates of bottles. Ben had painted Meadow Dairy on its sides in neat blue letters, and despite its practical nature, there was something almost jaunty about the little vehicle as it sat waiting for its daily rounds. As the first real light of day began to filter through the windows, other figures began to make their appearance in the world of Meadow Dairy's morning routine. May Reed, the dairy clerk, arrived promptly at 5 o'clock, her thin coat wrapped tightly about her against the cold. She was a quiet girl, precise in her work, with a particular talent for recording the lactometer readings that helped ensure the quality and purity of their product. Henry had learned to trust her careful hand with the books, though she rarely spoke unless spoken to first. Len Ogborn shuffled in shortly after May, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. Len was useful with mechanical things. It was he who kept the electric float running, and who could be relied upon to manage the heavier work about the loading ramp. He was an awkward sort of fellow, all elbows and knees, but there was no questioning his knowledge of ropes and pulleys, and the intricacies of moving heavy churns safely from place to place. The morning routine proceeded with the quiet efficiency that comes of long practice. Henry moved between the separator and the testing corner, checking the quality of the milk, while May recorded the readings in her neat, careful script. Ben sorted bottles and checked his route list, occasionally calling out questions about special orders or changes in delivery schedules. It was as the clock on the church tower struck the quarter hour at 5 that the first of their more challenging customers made her presence known. Violet Tanner, proprietor of the Copper Kettle Tea Room, had developed the unfortunate habit of arriving at the dairy just as the morning work was reaching its busiest point. She was a precise woman, sharp-featured and sharp-voiced, with a way of standing that suggested she was perpetually braced for disappointment. "Mr. Larch," she said without preamble, her voice cutting through the morning air like a knife through butter, "I trust there'll be no repetition of yesterday's difficulty with the cream. My customers expect consistency, and I cannot afford to serve them anything less." Henry's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The copper kettle bought by the churn, which should have been a profitable arrangement, but Violet Tanner had developed an unfortunate tendency toward late payment. More troubling still, there had been complaints recently about the quality of returned containers, milk that came back thin, as though it had been tampered with. Ben looked up from his ledger, and Henry saw something flash in his son's eyes. The boy had been keeping careful notes about such matters, and Henry suspected that Ben was preparing to address the situation more directly than his father's naturally diplomatic nature would prefer. "Everything will be quite satisfactory, Mrs. Tanner," Henry replied evenly, though his voice carried a note of cool formality that would not have been lost on anyone who knew him well. As the morning light grew stronger, the dairy became a bustling center of activity. The competing grocer, Sid Sykes, made his appearance as well, ostensibly to discuss some matter of mutual interest, though Henry suspected the man's real purpose was to assess whether any of Meadows' customers might be persuaded to switch their accounts. Sykes was a sleek man, well-dressed for such an early hour, with a slightly predatory smile of someone always alert to business opportunities. The stage was set, though none of them could have known it, for the tragedy that would transform this ordinary February morning into something far more sinister. In the growing daylight, with the familiar sounds of bottles clinking and churns being maneuvered into position, death was already making its preparations among the innocent tools of their trade. Chapter 2. A Fall on the Ramp. The crash, when it came, shattered the morning quiet like a stone through glass. Henry Larch had been bent over the cream separator, adjusting the flow rate with the methodical precision that characterized all his movements, when the sound erupted from the loading area, a tremendous, metallic clatter followed by a cry that was cut short with dreadful finality. The separator's steady hum seemed suddenly obscene in the silence that followed. "Ben!" Henry's voice cracked as he straightened, his hands still slick with cream. The cry had been his son's. He was certain of it, though something in its truncated nature filled him with a terror he had not felt since the telegram arrived about his wife's accident 2 winters past. May Reed stood frozen beside the testing table, her pencil suspended above the ledger as though time itself had stopped. Len Ogborn, who had been coiling rope near the doorway, dropped his work and lurched toward the loading ramp with his characteristic ungainliness. The sight that greeted them was one that would haunt Henry Larch for the remainder of his days. Ben lay crumpled at the foot of the wooden loading ramp, his body twisted at an angle that spoke eloquently of finality. Above him, a massive 10-gallon churn had toppled from its trestle. The heavy container now lay on its side like some enormous fallen soldier. Milk spread across the planking in a widening pool, its whiteness somehow obscene against the dark wood. Ben's peaked cap, the one he wore with such jaunty pride during his rounds, lay near the lower wheel stop that should have prevented exactly such an accident. The sight of it sitting there, as though waiting for its owner to reclaim it, was perhaps the most heartbreaking detail of all. "Get Dr. Haydock," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. And Inspector Slack?" Len nodded wordlessly and stumbled toward the telephone that hung on the wall beside the cash box. His hands shook as he lifted the receiver, and it took him 2 attempts to connect the call to the village exchange. Within minutes, it seemed, the dairy was filled with official voices and the sound of heavy boots. Dr. Haydock arrived first, his medical bag clutched in one hand and his coat hastily thrown over his nightclothes. He was a practical man, the village doctor, with no patience for sentiment when there was work to do. But even he paused when he saw the scene before him. "Blunt trauma," he pronounced after a brief examination, his voice professionally neutral, though his face was grave. "A heavy blow to the skull, consistent with being struck by a falling object. The impact appears to have been from a flat surface rather than a sharp corner. Exactly what one might expect from a rolling turn." Inspector Slack arrived shortly after, huffing slightly from his hurried bicycle ride from the police station. He was not a man given to imagination, Inspector Slack, preferring facts and obvious explanations to the sort of complications that made his job more difficult than it needed to be. He surveyed the scene with the air of a man who had already reached his conclusions. "Wet boards," he announced, gesturing toward the loading ramp with authority. "Look at them. Slick as anything. Young fellow must have slipped, knocked against the trestle, sent the whole thing toppling. Tragic, of course, but these things happen when people don't take proper care around heavy equipment." Henry wanted to protest, to explain that Ben had never been careless, that the boy knew every inch of the dairy's equipment better than he knew the lines of his own palm. But grief had stolen his voice, and he could only stand there, watching as Inspector Slack made his perfunctory notes and prepared to close what he clearly considered an open and shut case of misadventure. It was at this moment that Miss Jane Marple made her first appearance in the tragedy of Meadow Dairy. She had come, she explained in her gentle voice, to collect her morning milk, as was her habit. But something in the scene before her seemed to capture her attention in a way that went beyond mere morbid curiosity. She was a small woman, Miss Marple, with soft white hair and the kind of face that invited confidences from strangers. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance. Indeed, she possessed the almost supernatural ability to blend into the background, a gift that seemed peculiar to elderly ladies in small English villages. But her eyes, pale blue and deceptively mild, missed nothing as they took in the details of the accident scene. "How dreadful for you, Mr. Larch," she murmured, her voice full of genuine sympathy. "Such a fine young man, and so careful in all his ways. I've watched him loading that float many a morning on my way to early service, and I never saw him take a careless step." She moved closer to the scene, stepping carefully around the spreading pool of milk. Inspector Slack frowned slightly. He had no particular fondness for civilian interference in police matters, but Miss Marple's demeanor was so unthreatening that he made no move to discourage her. As she approached the lower wheel chock where Ben's cap lay abandoned, Miss Marple paused. Something had caught her attention, a darkened patch on the wooden planking, near the metal chock that should have prevented the churn from rolling with the unconscious grace of someone accustomed to examining small details. She bent and touched the tip of her finger to the stain. When she straightened, her fingertip glistened slightly, and she brought it close to her nose with the delicate precision of a wine connoisseur testing a vintage. Her expression, already thoughtful, grew distinctly puzzled. "How curious," she murmured, so quietly that only Henry, standing closest to her, could hear the words. "What's that, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice thick with grief and shock. She looked at him with those mild blue eyes, and Henry found himself thinking that there was something in her gaze that reminded him of his late wife's expression when she was working out a particularly challenging recipe. "It's only... well, this milk here, where my finger touched, it seems to be rather sweet. And raw milk fresh from the cow as it is never has that quality, does it? Raw milk is quite neutral in flavor, sometimes even slightly bitter, but never sweet. Sweet milk suggests..." She paused, seeming to consider her words carefully. "Well, it suggests that something has been added to it, doesn't it?" Inspector Slack had overheard enough of this exchange to feel his patience wearing thin. "With respect, Miss Marple, I think you'll find that's simply a trick of the light, or perhaps the shock of the morning affecting your senses. These tragic events can play havoc with one's perceptions." But Miss Marple was not so easily dismissed. She straightened slowly, brushing her hands together with characteristic practicality, and looked again at the scene before her. The upper wheel chalk, the wooden wedge that should have been firmly positioned to prevent exactly such an accident, sat perhaps a foot back from its usual notch in the trestle rail. It was a small detail, the sort of thing that might easily be overlooked in the drama of the moment. But Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it with obvious interest. "Mr. Larch," she said gently, "forgive me for asking at such a time, but was Ben in the habit of checking the positioning of those chalks during his morning routine?" Henry nodded, grateful for any opportunity to speak of his son's careful habits. "Every morning, regular as clockwork. Ben was particular about safety, said he'd rather spend an extra minute checking than spend a lifetime regretting carelessness. And the chalks were properly positioned yesterday evening when you finished work?" "Certainly. Ben always saw to that before we locked up." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her gaze moving now to the trestle rail itself. In the growing daylight, something caught her attention. A tiny glitter, barely visible on the metal surface, and below, gathered under the lip of the upper wheel chalk, was what appeared to be a light dusting of some granular substance. Inspector Slack was becoming increasingly impatient with what he clearly considered unnecessary complications to a straightforward case. "Really, Miss Marple, I think we must allow the proper authorities to handle these matters. Tragic accidents don't become less tragic simply because we examine them from every possible angle." But Henry Larch had found something compelling in the elderly lady's quiet observations. Perhaps it was the way she spoke of Ben with such respectful attention to his careful nature. Or perhaps it was simply the desperate need to believe that his son's death had been more than mere mischance. Whatever the reason, he found himself looking at the scene through Miss Marple's eyes, and what he saw there troubled him deeply. Inside the dairy, Ben's notebook lay open on the shelf where he had left it the evening before. Henry picked it up with trembling hands, and there, on the most recent page, written in Ben's neat script, were the words that would haunt him. "Cream to copper kettle. Return thin." The implications of that notation would not become fully clear until later, but even now Henry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February morning air. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices Sweet Milk. The morning sun had climbed higher now, casting long shadows across the dairy floor and illuminating details that had been hidden in the earlier gloom. Inspector Slack was preparing to leave, satisfied with his verdict of accidental death, when Miss Marple's quiet voice once again drew attention to matters he would have preferred to consider settled. "Mr. Larch," she said, moving toward the testing corner where the dairy's quality control equipment was arranged with military precision, "I wonder if you might explain something to me about your testing procedures." Henry followed her gaze to where a tall glass jar stood on the slate-topped table. The jar contained a sample of milk, and beside it lay the lactometer used each morning to verify the quality and purity of their product. "It was routine work," the sort of daily ritual that kept a small dairy's reputation intact. But Miss Marple was studying the arrangement as though it held secrets of profound importance. "The lactometer measures the specific gravity of the milk," Henry explained, grateful for the distraction from his grief. "May takes the reading first thing each morning and records it in the ledger. It helps us ensure that our product meets the proper standards." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, then bent closer to examine the slate surface beneath the jar. Where the milk had dried, it had left a ring, but not the sort of ring one would expect from ordinary raw milk. This residue had a crystalline quality to it, and when Miss Marple touched it with a fingertip, it crumbled slightly, leaving a gritty texture that reminded her of nothing so much as dried sugar syrup. "How very interesting," she murmured, bringing her finger to her lips with the same delicate precision she'd shown earlier. The taste confirmed her suspicions. There was sweetness here where no sweetness should be. She straightened and looked at Henry with an expression of gentle inquiry. "Tell me, Mr. Larch, in your experience, does raw milk ever develop a sweet taste naturally?" Henry shook his head emphatically. "Never. Good fresh milk has very little taste at all. Certainly nothing sweet. Sweet milk usually means something's been added to it, though I can't imagine why anyone would do such a thing. Can't you?" Miss Marple's voice was mild, but there was something in her tone that made Henry look at her more closely. "I was thinking, you see, about what I learned from my nephew Raymond, who works in the dairy trade in London. He once mentioned that there are ways of, shall we say, disguising certain problems with milk quality. If someone were to water down milk, for instance, the lactometer would detect the deception immediately. But if one were to add sugar to the watered milk, it might restore the proper specific gravity reading." The implications of this observation hung in the air like smoke. Henry's face grew pale as he considered what she was suggesting, and he glanced instinctively toward the shelf where Ben's notebook lay, with its troubling notation about thin cream returned from the copper kettle. "You're not suggesting," he began, then stopped himself, unable to voice the possibility that someone might have been tampering with their milk. "I'm not suggesting anything definite," Miss Marple replied gently. "But I think it might be wise to examine things a bit more carefully before we conclude that poor Ben's death was simply a matter of unfortunate accident." She moved back toward the loading ramp, where the evidence of the tragedy still lay scattered across the wooden planking. Inspector Slack had already examined the scene to his satisfaction, but Miss Marple's approach was different, methodical in a way that reminded Henry of his wife's approach to spring cleaning, leaving no corner unexplored. It was then that Lady Bantry arrived, having heard the news from Mrs. Pike at the post office. Dolly Bantry was Miss Marple's oldest friend in St. Mary Me, a woman of forthright manner and generous heart, who had never hesitated to involve herself in matters that caught her interest. "Jane," she said, slightly out of breath from her hurried walk, "whatever has happened here?" Mrs. Pike said there was an accident, but the way she spoke— "Poor young Ben Larch was killed this morning," Miss Marple explained quietly. "A very sad business. The inspector believes it was an accident, a slip on wet boards that caused a churn to fall." Lady Bantry looked around the scene with the eye of someone accustomed to taking charge in difficult situations. "How dreadful. But you don't seem entirely convinced it was accidental, do you, Jane?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that there are one or two details that might bear closer examination. For instance, Dolly, would you mind coming here and telling me what you smell?" Lady Bantry obediently approached the darkened patch near the wheel chalk, where Miss Marple had first detected the sweet odor. She bent and sniffed delicately, then straightened with a puzzled expression. "It's sweet," she said with some surprise. "Rather like milk that's had sugar added to it. But surely that can't be right." "That's exactly what I thought," Miss Marple agreed. "And you see, it's not the sort of sweetness that develops naturally. Raw milk, even when it begins to sour, becomes sharp and acid, never sweet. This suggests that sugar has been deliberately added. Inspector Slack, who had been growing increasingly impatient with what he considered unnecessary complications, finally decided to intervene. Really, ladies, I think we must be practical about this. Young men working with heavy equipment in the early morning hours, accidents happen. There's no need to look for mysteries where none exist, but Miss Marple was not to be deterred. She'd noticed something else that troubled her. The rim of the testing jar showed the same slight stickiness she had observed on the wooden planking. When she mentioned this to May Reed, the young woman grew visibly uncomfortable. "I don't know anything about that," May said quickly, her voice higher than usual. "I just take the readings and write them down, same as always." "Of course you do, dear," Miss Marple said soothingly. "And I'm sure your readings are always accurate. But I was wondering, have you noticed anything unusual about the milk lately? Anything that might have struck you as odd?" May glanced nervously toward Henry, then back at Miss Marple. "Well," she said hesitantly, "there was that business yesterday with the copper kettle return. Ben was quite upset about it. Said the cream had come back thin, like it had been." She stopped abruptly, as though realizing she had said too much. "Like it had been what, dear?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "Like it had been tampered with," May finished reluctantly. "But I'm sure there's some innocent explanation." Henry's jaw tightened as the full implications of these observations began to settle in his mind. The possibility that someone had been adulterating his milk, his carefully produced, quality milk that bore the large family reputation, was almost as devastating as his son's death. "Ben meant to speak to Violet Tanner first thing this morning," he said slowly. "He was planning to ask her about the returns and if he wasn't satisfied with her explanation." Henry's voice trailed off as he realized what he was saying. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "It does suggest a motive, doesn't it? If someone had been engaged in deception and feared exposure, they might have been desperate enough to take drastic action to prevent it. The dairy, which had been a scene of innocent morning industry just hours before, now seemed charged with darker possibilities. Inspector Slack might be satisfied with his verdict of accidental death, but Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that the truth was considerably more complicated and far more sinister. Chapter 4. 2 foils. 1 bottle. It was Lady Bantry who first drew attention to the shelf above the loading ramp, though she did so quite by accident. In her characteristic manner of involving herself thoroughly in any situation that captured her interest, she had been examining the dairy's equipment with the sort of methodical attention that might have been applied to cataloging the contents of a museum. "Jane," she called out, "what's this contraption up here? It looks rather like a bottle turned upside down in some sort of clamp." Miss Marple looked up from her examination of the testing equipment and followed Lady Bantry's pointing finger to where, indeed, a half-pint milk bottle sat inverted, in a wooden clamp that appeared to be designed for the purpose of draining bottles after washing. It was an innocent enough sight, the sort of practical arrangement one might expect to find in any well-organized dairy. But something about the bottle's position troubled Miss Marple in a way she could not immediately articulate. Perhaps it was the way the morning light caught the foil cap. Or perhaps it was simply the instinct for detail that had served her well in previous encounters with unexplained deaths. Whatever the reason, she found herself studying the arrangement with growing interest. "Mr. Larch," she said, "is it usual to leave bottles drying in that particular spot? It seems rather an odd place for it, directly above the loading area." Henry followed her gaze and frowned. "No, that's not where we typically put bottles to dry. Usually they'd be in the washing area near the sink. I can't think why anyone would put one there." Miss Marple approached the shelf with careful steps, like someone navigating unfamiliar territory. The bottle was positioned precisely above the spot where she had detected the sweet milk residue. As she drew closer, she noticed something that made her pause with sudden understanding. The foil cap that sealed the bottle's mouth appeared untouched, smooth and properly crimped in the manner that suggested it had never been opened. But there was something about its appearance that struck her as not quite right, though she could not immediately identify what it was. With the delicate precision that characterized all her movements, Miss Marple reached up and carefully slid the bottle from its clamp. The wooden device held it firmly but released it easily when lifted straight up, and she lowered the bottle to examine it more closely. What she discovered confirmed her growing suspicions about the true nature of Ben Larch's death. Beneath the apparently pristine foil cap was a second foil, neatly pressed against the bottle's rim and secured with all the skill of someone familiar with dairy equipment. But this inner foil bore a small, precise puncture in its exact center, a hole no larger than might be made with a hat pin or a similar implement. "How very clever," Miss Marple murmured, holding the bottle up to the light so that the pinhole became clearly visible. "And how very deliberate." Lady Bantry leaned in to examine the discovery. 2 foils. But why on earth would anyone do such a thing? "I think," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "that someone wanted this bottle to appear unopened while actually allowing its contents to drip out very slowly. You see, the top foil would hide the fact that the inner seal had been punctured. From a casual glance, everything would look perfectly normal." She turned the bottle in her hands, and as she did so, the light revealed another telling detail. The outside of the glass showed a faint tide mark, the sort of stain that might be left by liquid that had slowly trickled down its surface over an extended period. Henry was beginning to understand the implications of what they were discovering. "You mean someone deliberately arranged for milk to drip from this bottle?" "It would seem so," Miss Marple replied. "And if we look beneath the shelf—" She bent to examine the wooden planking directly below where the bottle had been positioned. Sure enough, there was a circular stain on the boards, sticky to the touch and exactly the size of the bottle's mouth. Inspector Slack, who had been preparing to depart for the police station, found himself reluctantly drawn back into the investigation. "Now see here, Miss Marple, you can't simply go about moving evidence and drawing conclusions from every little thing you find. There could be perfectly innocent explanations for all of this." "Oh, I'm quite sure there could be," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "But taken together, these details do begin to suggest a rather interesting possibility. Someone has gone to considerable trouble to create what amounts to a very slow, very controlled leak of liquid, and the timing appears to have been quite precise." She examined the top foil more closely, noting that its crimp around the bottle's rim showed signs of having been removed and replaced. There was a faint second line in the metal, just visible to someone looking for it. That suggested the cap had been lifted and then pressed back into place. "The question," Miss Marple continued, "is what purpose such an arrangement might serve. Why would someone want milk to drip very slowly from a bottle positioned above the loading ramp?" May Reed, who had been listening to this exchange with growing unease, suddenly spoke up. "The recapper," she said, in a voice barely above a whisper. "I beg your pardon?" Miss Marple turned to the young woman with gentle encouragement. "The recapper?" May repeated, her face pale. "It's a tool we use for putting fresh foils on bottles when the original ones get damaged. Mrs. Tanner borrowed it yesterday. Said she wanted to tidy up some bottles for a display in her tea room." The significance of this information was not lost on anyone present. Violet Tanner, proprietor of the Copper Kettle, would have had both the knowledge and the equipment necessary to create the double foil arrangement they had discovered. Henry's face had grown grim as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Ben was planning to confront her this morning about the thin cream returns. If she'd been watering our milk and thought she was about to be exposed, She might have been desperate enough to take drastic action to prevent that exposure, Miss Marple finished quietly. The question now is whether this bottle arrangement was designed to create some sort of timing mechanism. Lady Bantry examined the wooden clamp more closely. It's positioned perfectly to drip onto that spot where you found the sweet residue. Jane. And if something was supporting the churn above, Miss Marple concluded, and that something was designed to fail after a certain amount of liquid had accumulated, then we have a very clever murder weapon, one that would allow the killer to be elsewhere when the actual death occurred, creating what would appear to be an unshakable alibi. The dairy, which had seemed a place of honest industry just hours before, now revealed itself as the setting for a crime of considerable sophistication. Someone had used the familiar tools and routines of milk production to create an instrument of death, timing it with the precision that spoke of intimate knowledge of Ben Larch's morning habits. Inspector Slack found himself faced with evidence that even his preference for simple explanations could not easily dismiss. The double foil bottle, with its deliberate puncture and careful positioning, suggested a level of premeditation that transformed an apparent accident into something far more sinister. "We'll need to examine everything more carefully," he admitted grudgingly, "and we'll need to speak with Mrs. Tanner about this recapper business." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "Indeed we shall. But I suspect we'll find that there are several more pieces to this puzzle before we understand exactly how poor Ben met his death." Chapter 5. Sugar Cubes. Under the Chalk. The morning had progressed from tragedy to investigation with the inexorable momentum of a story that demanded to be told in full. Miss Marple, having discovered the curious arrangement of the double-foiled bottle, now turned her attention to the upper reaches of the loading ramp, where the wooden chalk sat displaced from its proper position. "Lady Bantry," she said in her characteristically gentle manner, "I wonder if you might assist me with something rather heavy. I believe we should examine what lies beneath that wheel chalk." Dolly Bantry, who had never been one to shrink from physical exertion when the occasion demanded it, nodded briskly and joined Miss Marple beside the trestle rail. The wooden chalk was substantial, a wedge-shaped block designed to bear considerable weight, but between the two women, it could be managed with care. "Inspector?" Slack watched their efforts with the resigned expression of a man who had learned that resistance to Miss Marple's investigative methods was generally futile. "Mind you don't disturb anything important," he cautioned, though his tone suggested he expected his warning to be cheerfully ignored. As they lifted the chalk from its resting place, Miss Marple's suspicions were immediately confirmed. Wedged beneath the wooden block were 2 sugar cubes. Their edges softened and partially dissolved, creating a sticky residue that had clearly been in contact with the liquid for some time. The cubes bore traces of blue paper wrapping that had become embedded in the wood grain like tiny flags of evidence. "Sugar cubes," Lady Bantry observed with satisfaction. "And not just any sugar cubes, if I'm not mistaken. Those blue paper wrappings are quite distinctive. They're the sort that Sykes uses at his grocery." Miss Marple examined the partially dissolved cubes with the same careful attention she might have devoted to a particularly challenging bit of needlework. The sugar had been systematically weakened by moisture, and 1 cube had been reduced to little more than a crystalline stub caught in a crack in the wood. From this remnant, a trail of sugary syrup led directly toward the notch where the chalk should have been properly seated. "How very ingenious," she murmured, her voice filled with the sort of appreciation one might reserve for a particularly clever piece of craftsmanship. "Someone has created what amounts to a dissolving support system. As liquid dripped from above, these cubes would have gradually weakened until they could no longer bear the weight of the chalk." Henry Larch, who had been following the investigation with growing amazement and horror, stared at the evidence before him. You mean someone deliberately arranged for the churn to roll down at a specific time? It would appear so, Miss Marple replied. The timing would depend on several factors: the rate at which the liquid dripped from the bottle above, the size and composition of the sugar cubes, and the ambient temperature and humidity. But for someone familiar with these conditions, it might be possible to calculate the timing quite precisely. The implications of this discovery sent a chill through the assembled group that had nothing to do with the February morning air. What they were looking at was not the evidence of an accident, but the remnants of an elaborately planned murder, weapon, one that had been designed, to strike at the exact moment when Ben Larch would be conducting his morning inspection, Lady. Bantry examined the blue paper fragments with keen interest. Jane, these wrappings, they're not the sort that Meadow Dairy would use for their own sugar, are they? Henry shook his head emphatically. We buy our sugar in bulk from the wholesaler. Plain white cubes in brown paper strips. These blue-wrapped ones are what Sykes sells to tea rooms and private customers. The copper kettle uses them for their table service. May added quietly, then seemed to regret having spoken as all eyes turned toward her. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. So we have sugar cubes that are specifically associated with commercial tea service, positioned in such a way as to create a timing mechanism for what would appear to be an accidental death. The question now becomes, who had access to both the dairy premises and the knowledge necessary to construct such a device? Inspector Slack, who'd been examining the sugar cube remnants with reluctant fascination, straightened and fixed Miss Marple with a stern look. Now, Miss Marple, I'll grant you that this is all very interesting, but we can't go about accusing people of murder based on sugar cube wrappers and dripping bottles. There could be perfectly innocent explanations for all of this. Oh, I'm quite sure there could be, Miss Marple agreed with her customary mildness. But the combination of evidence does begin to paint a rather compelling picture, doesn't it? Someone with access to copper kettle sugar cubes, knowledge of dairy equipment, and familiarity with Ben's morning routine has constructed what amounts to a delayed-action murder weapon. She gestured toward the trail of syrup that led from the dissolved cube remnant to the chalk's proper position. You see how the sugar has created exactly the sort of slippery surface that would cause a properly positioned wheel chalk to slide out of place. The liquid from above would have weakened the cubes gradually, and when they finally gave way, the chalk would have slipped along the sugary track, directly into the path of the rolling churn. The precision of the mechanism was both admirable and horrifying. Someone had turned the familiar tools of the dairy trade into instruments of death, using milk and sugar, the most innocent of substances, to create a weapon that would strike with lethal accuracy. But who would have had the opportunity to set up such an arrangement? Henry asked, his voice heavy with the realization that someone he knew, someone who had been welcomed into his dairy, had used his trust to murder his son. That, Miss Marple said softly, is what we must determine. But I think we can safely assume that our killer is someone who understands both the routines of Meadow Dairy and the properties of sugar when exposed to moisture, someone who knew exactly when Ben would be standing at the foot of that ramp, and someone who had access to both the dairy premises and the specific type of sugar cubes we've discovered. As the full horror of the crime began to sink in, the dairy that had been Henry Larch's pride and livelihood took on the aspect of a place violated by betrayal. Someone had perverted the honest tools of his trade, turning milk and sugar into implements of murder with a cold calculation that spoke of long planning and intimate knowledge. The morning sun, climbing higher now, cast new shadows across the scene, and in those shadows Miss Marple saw the outline of a crime that was far from solved. The dissolving sugar cubes had provided the timing mechanism, but the identity of the person who had placed them there remained to be discovered. Chapter 6. Lactometer Reading. Cream Line Wrong. The discovery of the sugar cube mechanism had cast the entire dairy operation in a new and sinister light. But Miss Marple was far from finished with her examination of the evidence. With a methodical thoroughness that had served her well in previous encounters with criminal minds, she returned her attention to the testing area, where May Reed's careful records might reveal additional secrets. The morning light streaming through the dairy windows now illuminated details that had been obscured in the earlier confusion. Miss Marple approached the counter where the day's milk samples stood in their neat array, each bottle representing a different batch that would be distributed throughout St. Mary Me. But it was not the current samples that captured her attention. It was a single bottle that sat slightly apart from the others. Its cream line was tellingly thin for milk that should have been rich with the morning's best production. "Mr. Larch," she said, indicating the bottle with a gentle gesture, "this milk appears rather different from the others. The cream has not risen as one might expect from your usual quality." Henry examined the bottle with the practiced eye of a man who had spent his lifetime evaluating milk quality. His expression grew troubled as he noted the sparse cream line that spoke of milk that had been compromised in some fashion. "That's not right," he admitted reluctantly. "Our morning milk should show a thick cream separation by this hour. This looks like milk that's been—" He paused, unwilling to voice the possibility that was becoming increasingly unavoidable. "Like milk that has been watered down," Miss Marple suggested gently, "and perhaps then treated with sugar to restore its apparent specific gravity." The implications hung in the air like smoke from a smoldering fire. Lady Bantry, who had been following the investigation with keen interest, moved closer to examine the evidence for herself. "But surely the lactometer readings would detect such tampering," she observed. "I thought that was the entire purpose of those daily tests." Miss Marple turned her attention to May Reed, who had been growing increasingly pale as the investigation progressed. The young woman stood beside her testing table like a witness in the dock, her hands twisting nervously in her apron. "Miss Reed," Miss Marple said in her kindest voice, "I wonder if you might show us yesterday's lactometer readings. I'm particularly interested in the figures you recorded for the copper kettle delivery." May's hands trembled slightly as she opened the ledger to the previous day's entries. The page showed her neat, careful script, recording a series of readings that all fell within the acceptable range for quality milk, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted something that others might have missed: the slight difference in ink, color that suggested some entries had been made at different times, and the faint impressions on the blot beneath that hinted at erasures and corrections. "These readings appeared to have been recorded twice," Miss Marple observed gently. "Was there some difficulty with the original figures?" May's composure finally cracked under the weight of the accumulated evidence and Miss Marple's persistent but kindly questioning. I only did what I was told," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet dairy. "Mrs. Tanner said there must have been some mistake with the readings, that the figures couldn't possibly be correct." The confession hung between them like a bridge suddenly revealed in fog. Henry's face grew ashen as he understood the full scope of what had been happening under his very nose. "You mean Violet Tanner asked you to falsify the lactometer readings?" "She said it would only be temporary," May rushed to explain, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "She said she was having difficulties with her supplier and just needed a few weeks to sort things out. She promised me extra money and I needed it for my mother's medicine." Miss Marple nodded with the sympathetic understanding of someone who had seen how financial desperation could corrupt even the most honest intentions. "And the milk that came back from the copper kettle, it was thin, wasn't it?" "Watered down," May nodded miserably. Ben noticed it first. He started keeping track of the returns, writing everything down in his notebook. "Yesterday he told me he was going to speak to his father about it, and then to Mrs. Tanner herself. He said he couldn't let the dairy's reputation be damaged by what someone else was doing. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with the inexorable logic of a well-constructed mechanism. Violet Tanner had been systematically adulterating the milk she purchased from Meadow Dairy, watering it down to stretch her supplies, and then adding sugar to mask the deception from casual testing. When Ben Larch had discovered her scheme and threatened to expose it, she had resorted to murder to protect her secret. Inspector Slack, who had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, finally found his voice. But hang on. If Mrs. Tanner was watering down the milk she bought, why would she need to worry about exposure? Surely that's her own business. What she does with milk after she's purchased it. Miss Marple turned to him with a patient expression of a teacher, explaining a difficult concept to a struggling pupil because, Inspector, she wasn't simply using watered milk in her tea room. She was returning the excess to the dairy as if it were unused surplus, collecting a credit for milk that was no longer pure. In effect, she was defrauding Mr. Larch by selling him back his own milk in a deteriorated condition. And worse than that, Henry added, his voice heavy with the realization of how thoroughly he had been deceived. She was damaging our reputation. If word got out that Meadow Dairy was accepting substandard returns and mixing them back into our supply, we'd lose every customer in the village. The economic implications were staggering. A small dairy's reputation was its most valuable asset built over generations, and easily destroyed by even the suggestion of compromised quality. Violet Tanner's scheme had threatened not only the Larch family's livelihood, but the trust that bound the dairy to its community. Lady Bantry examined the blot more closely, noting the faint impressions left by May's pencil. It looks as though the original readings were quite different from what was finally recorded. The true figures would have revealed immediately that something was wrong with the returned milk. Ben suspected, May said quietly. He asked me about the discrepancies, and I could see he wasn't satisfied with my explanations. He was planning to do his own test this morning to verify the quality of everything we had in stock. Miss Marple felt a wave of sadness for the young man, whose conscientiousness had ultimately led to his death. Ben Larch had died because he had been too honest to overlook what he saw, too dedicated to his family's reputation, to allow it to be compromised by another's greed. So Mrs. Tanner knew that Ben was becoming suspicious, she summarized. She knew that exposure was imminent, and she took desperate measures to prevent it. The timing mechanism we discovered was set to strike at the precise moment when Ben would be conducting his morning inspection, a moment she knew about because she had observed his routines during her visits to the dairy. The portrait that emerged was of a crime planned with meticulous attention to detail, using intimate knowledge of the dairy's operations to create what would appear to be a tragic accident. But Miss Marple was not yet finished with her investigation. There were still questions to be answered about alibis and opportunities, and she suspected that the full truth was more complex than even these revelations suggested. Chapter 7, Blue Paper in the Crate. The revelation of May Reed's involvement in falsifying the lactometer readings had provided crucial insight into Violet Tanner's motive. But Miss Marple was not one to consider an investigation complete until every thread had been followed to its logical conclusion. With a persistence that had made her formidable in previous encounters with criminal minds, she now turned her attention to the physical evidence that might definitively link the copper kettle's proprietress to the elaborate murder mechanism. "Mr. Larch," she said, approaching the area where the empty bottle crates were stacked awaiting collection, "I wonder if you might show me the containers that were returned from the copper kettle yesterday. I have a particular interest in examining them closely." Henry led her to a wooden crate bearing the neat painted legend, "Copper Kettle, Tanner in black letters." The crate contained the usual assortment of empty milk bottles, their interior still bearing the faint residue of their former contents. But Miss Marple's attention was drawn not to the bottles themselves, but to the small debris that had collected in the corners of the crate during transport. Among the inevitable accumulation of dust and lint, she discovered what she'd been hoping to find: a small, crumpled fragment of blue paper that bore the distinctive pattern of sugar cube wrapping. The scrap was no larger than a postage stamp, but its presence in the copper kettle's return crate provided a direct physical link between Violet Tanner and the sugar cubes that had been used to construct the timing mechanism. "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured, carefully extracting the fragment with the tip of her finger. "This appears to be from the same type of wrapping we found beneath the wheel chalk." Lady Bantry examined the scrap with keen interest. "It's definitely the same blue paper that Sykes uses for his cube sugar. But what would it be doing in a milk crate?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "it fell from someone's pocket or apron while they were handling both the returned bottles and the sugar cubes that would later be used in the murder mechanism." Inspector Slack, who had been growing increasingly convinced that Miss Marple's investigation was revealing genuine evidence of premeditated murder, made careful note of the discovery. "We'll need to have this examined properly," he said, producing an envelope into which the fragment could be safely preserved. But Miss Marple was not finished with her search of the dairy premises. Moving with the methodical thoroughness of someone conducting a comprehensive spring cleaning, she turned her attention to the yard behind the building where the refuse bins were kept. Here, among the ordinary detritus of dairy operations, she hoped to find additional evidence of the killer's preparations. Her patience was rewarded when she discovered, nestled among the discarded foil caps and paper wrappings that were the inevitable byproducts of the bottling process, a small circle of metal foil bearing a telltale pinhole in its center. Unlike the other foil caps in the bin, this one had not been flattened or crumpled. It had been carefully placed as though its discoverer wished to preserve its condition for examination. "The inner foil from our double-capped bottle," she announced with satisfaction, "disposed of separately from the outer cap to avoid leaving obvious evidence of the deception." Henry examined the pierced foil with the same careful attention he brought to all aspects of his business. "That's definitely one of our standard bottle caps," he confirmed. "But I've never seen one with such a neat, precise hole through the center." "Made with a hat pin, I should think," Miss Marple observed. "Or perhaps a large needle, something that would create a controlled opening without tearing the foil in a way that might be immediately obvious." The accumulation of evidence was becoming overwhelming in its implications. The fragments of blue sugar paper, the carefully preserved inner foil, the falsified lactometer readings, all pointed to a single conclusion that even Inspector Slack could no longer dismiss as coincidence. It was at this moment that Len Ogborn, who had been conspicuously absent during much of the investigation, returned to the dairy with news that would further illuminate the timing of the crime. He had been, he explained, collecting his paycheck from Sykes's grocery for some electrical work performed the previous evening. "Funny thing," he said, his awkward manner making him seem even more uncomfortable than usual. "Sykes mentioned that Mrs. Tanner was in yesterday evening just before closing. Bought a packet of cube sugar." "She did. Said she was running low for the morning tea service." Miss Marple turned to him with sharp interest. "Did Mr. Sykes mention what time this was?" "Just after 6, he said. Unusual time for her to be shopping. She usually sends that boy of hers around for supplies during the day." The timing was significant. If Violet Tanner had purchased sugar cubes yesterday evening, it suggested that her murder plan had been formulated and set in motion well before Ben Larch's intended confrontation this morning. The crime had not been committed in a moment of panic, but had been carefully planned and executed with cold deliberation. But it was Len's next revelation that provided perhaps the most damning evidence yet. As he spoke, He unconsciously wiped his hands on a rag that bore dark stains, and Miss Marple noticed something that made her pause with sudden understanding. "Mr. Ogborn," she said carefully, "I notice you have some sort of lubricant on your hands. Have you been working on machinery this morning?" Len looked down at his stained fingers with surprise. I oiled the milk float around 4 o'clock, part of the regular maintenance. But that's not what's got my hands dirty now." He held up the rag, revealing that the stains were not the black of mechanical grease, but something altogether different. "Found this on the shelf where that bottle was sitting. Looks like someone used grease to make sure the clamp held tight. Wanted to be certain the bottle wouldn't slip out of position before it was meant to." The implications were staggering. Not only had the killer used sugar cubes as a timing mechanism and milk as the trigger liquid, but they had also taken the precaution of ensuring that their improvised apparatus would function exactly as planned. The grease on the clamp jaws would have held the bottle firmly in position until the precise moment when the sugar supports failed and the churn was released. Miss Marple examined the shelf clamp more closely, noting the telltale smears that Len had discovered. "Someone went to considerable trouble to ensure this mechanism would work properly," she observed. This was not the work of an amateur or someone acting in desperate haste. The picture that emerged was of a crime planned and executed with meticulous attention to detail. Every element of the murder weapon had been carefully considered and precisely positioned. The killer had understood not only the routines of the dairy, but also the properties of the materials they were using and the mechanical principles that would govern their improvised timing device. But who would have had the knowledge to construct such a device? Henry asked, his voice heavy with the realization that someone he had trusted had perverted his honest business into an instrument of murder. "Someone," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, "who understood both the operations of your dairy and the properties of sugar when exposed to moisture. Someone who knew exactly when Ben would be standing at the foot of that ramp, and someone who had access to the necessary materials and equipment." The web of evidence was tightening around Violet Tanner with inexorable logic. But Miss Marple knew that proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt would require more than physical evidence. She would need to demonstrate not only opportunity and means, but also the specific timeline that had allowed the crime to be committed, while the killer established what appeared to be an unshakable alibi. Chapter 2. 8. Alibis between 4 and 5. The accumulation of physical evidence had painted a compelling picture of premeditated murder, but Miss Marple understood that any successful prosecution would require a thorough examination of alibis and opportunities. The killer had constructed an elaborate timing mechanism precisely to avoid being present when the crime occurred, which meant that establishing everyone's whereabouts during the crucial morning hours would be essential to proving guilt. Inspector Slack, now fully convinced that they were dealing with a case of deliberate murder rather than accidental death, had taken charge of questioning the various individuals who might have had access to the dairy during the critical period. His notebook was filling with times and locations as he methodically worked through the list of potential suspects. "Mr. Larch," he began, consulting his notes with official precision, "I need to establish your exact whereabouts between 4 and 5 o'clock this morning. Can you account for your movements during that time?" Henry, still pale with shock at the revelation that his son had been murdered, struggled to recall the routine details that had seemed so ordinary just hours before. "I arrived at the dairy at approximately 4:15, he said slowly. "I spent the first few minutes lighting the lamps and checking that everything was in order from the previous evening. Then I went directly to the cream separator, which needed adjustment after yesterday's heavy run." "And you remained at the separator for how long?" "From about 4:20 until 4:35, Henry replied with increasing certainty. May confirmed that she was carrying cream pails from the separator to the cooling area during that entire period. We were working within sight of each other the whole time. May Reed nodded her confirmation, though her face remained drawn with guilt over her part in the lactometer deception. Mr. Larch was at the separator continuously during that time, she said quietly. I made 3 trips with the cream pails, and he was there each time I came and went. Miss Marple made note of this timing with interest. If Henry had been occupied with the separator during the crucial period when the murder mechanism would have been triggered, it effectively eliminated him as a suspect, though she had never seriously considered that he might have harmed his own son. Inspector Slack turned his attention to Len Ogborn, whose mechanical knowledge made him a person of particular interest. Now then, Mr. Ogborn, what about your movements this morning? Len shifted uncomfortably under the inspector's scrutiny, his awkward manner making him appear more suspicious than his actual actions warranted. I was working on the milk float from about 4 o'clock onward, he said. Regular maintenance, checking the battery connections, oiling the mechanical parts, that sort of thing. Can anyone verify this? Well, Len said thoughtfully, I had to fetch a replacement battery from Sykes's place around 4:25. He'd promised to have one ready for collection, said I could pick it up early since he lives above the shop. This information prompted Miss Marple to suggest that they speak with Sid Sykes directly, as his testimony might provide crucial verification of Len's whereabouts during the critical period. A telephone call brought the grocer to the dairy within minutes, his sleek appearance somewhat disheveled by the early hour, but his manner as sharp as ever. Certainly, I can confirm Mr. Ogborn's visit, Sykes said with the precision of a man accustomed to keeping careful business records. He arrived at exactly 4:24. I noted the time because I'd promised to have the battery ready for early collection. Here's the delivery chit with his signature and the timestamp. The document he produced bore Len's laborious signature and the time 4:24 A. Written in Sykes's neat commercial script. If accurate, it would place Len at the grocery during the crucial period when the murder mechanism would have been activated. How long did this transaction take? Inspector Slack inquired. Perhaps 5 minutes, Sykes replied. We had to test the battery to ensure it was properly charged, and Mr. Ogborn mentioned some difficulty with the float's electrical connections. I offered some advice on the wiring. Miss Marple found herself considering the implications of this timing. If Len had been at the grocery from 4:24 until approximately 4:30, and if the murder had occurred at 4:50, as the evidence suggested, there would have been sufficient time for him to return to the dairy and set the mechanism in motion. However, his mechanical expertise, while making him capable of constructing such a device, did not provide him with an obvious motive for wanting Ben Larch dead. The inspector's questioning next turned to Violet Tanner herself, though she had not yet been formally summoned to the dairy. Her whereabouts during the crucial morning hours would need to be established through other witnesses, and it was here that the investigation took a particularly interesting turn. Mrs. Pike, the postmistress, had been contacted by telephone and confirmed that she had indeed seen Violet Tanner unlocking the copper kettle at precisely 4:40 that morning. This was unusual, Mrs. Pike explained, as the tea room normally did not open until 7 to serve breakfast to early travelers. She said something about a special delivery of cakes, Mrs. Pike reported when she arrived at the dairy to give her statement. Mentioned that the bakery truck was coming early and she needed to be there to receive it. This alibi appeared remarkably convenient, providing Violet Tanner with a legitimate reason to be up and about during the crucial morning hours while also placing her at her own establishment, rather than at the dairy when the murder occurred. However, Miss Marple noted that 4:40 was very close to the time when Ben Larch had met his death, suggesting that if Violet had indeed committed the crime, she'd cut her timing extremely fine. Further inquiry revealed that Violet had sent her Usual delivery boy to Sykes's grocery for additional sugar cubes just before 5 o'clock, a detail that Mrs. Pike confirmed she had witnessed while opening the post office for the morning mail sorting. Seemed in quite a hurry, she did, Mrs. Pike added. Called out to young Tommy to run quick to Sykes for a packet of cubes. Said she'd run short for the morning tea service. Miss Marple found this detail particularly significant. If Violet Tanner had used her own sugar cubes to construct the timing mechanism, she might well have found herself running short for her legitimate business needs, necessitating the urgent purchase of additional supplies. The timeline that emerged from these various testimonies was revealing in its precision. Violet Tanner had been seen unlocking her premises at 4:40, just 10 minutes before Ben Larch's death. This would have allowed her barely enough time to set the murder mechanism in motion and return to establish her alibi, assuming she had prepared everything in advance. But it was Inspector Slack's final inquiry that provided perhaps the most damning evidence yet. When asked about the recapping tool that May Reed had mentioned, it transpired that Violet Tanner had indeed borrowed the device the previous day, ostensibly to repair some damaged bottle caps for a display in her tea room window. She was very particular about getting it back to us today, May recalled. Said she'd return it first thing this morning when she came for her regular delivery. The implication was clear. Violet Tanner had borrowed the exact tool needed to create the double foil bottle mechanism that had served as the trigger for the murder weapon. Combined with her purchase of sugar cubes the previous evening and her conveniently timed presence at her own establishment during the crucial morning hours, the evidence was building an increasingly damning case against the Copper Kettle's proprietress. Yet Miss Marple sensed that there were still pieces of the puzzle missing. The timing of the crime had been executed with such precision that it suggested not only careful planning, but also intimate knowledge of the dairy's operations and Ben Larch's personal habits. She suspected that the full truth would prove even more complex than the evidence had so far revealed. Chapter 9. The Drip That Chose the Minute. The weight of circumstantial evidence against Violet Tanner had grown considerably, but Miss Marple understood that proving the mechanics of the crime would be essential to securing a conviction. With a methodical patience that had served her well in previous investigations, she now turned her attention to demonstrating exactly how the elaborate murder weapon had functioned. "Inspector Slack," she said, approaching the shelf above, the loading ramp with renewed purpose. "I believe it would be instructive to reconstruct the timing mechanism that our killer employed. With your permission, I should like to conduct a small experiment." The inspector, now fully convinced of the seriousness of the case, nodded his agreement. He had learned from previous encounters with Miss Marple that her practical demonstrations often provided the clearest evidence of how seemingly impossible crimes had been committed. Miss Marple began by selecting a clean half-pint bottle from the dairy stock and carefully examining one of the standard foil caps. With the precision of someone accustomed to domestic tasks requiring exact measurements, she used a hat pin borrowed from Lady Bantry to create a small, neat hole in the center of the foil. "The first step," she explained as she worked, "would have been to prepare the inner seal with a controlled puncture. The hole must be large enough to allow liquid to drip through, but small enough that the flow remains slow and steady." She then demonstrated how a second foil cap could be pressed firmly over the first, creating the appearance of an unopened bottle while concealing the punctured inner seal beneath. "You see how the outer foil disguises the fact that the inner seal has been compromised," she continued, holding the bottle up for inspection. From any casual examination, this would appear to be a perfectly normal, unopened bottle of milk. Having prepared the bottle, Miss Marple filled it with milk from the testing supply and carefully positioned it in the wooden clamp above the loading ramp. The bottle sat inverted, its punctured seal pointing downward toward the spot where the wheel chalk normally rested. "Now," she said, moving to the trestle where the churn had been replaced after the morning's tragedy, "we must recreate the support system that held the churn in position." Under Miss Marple's direction, Inspector Slack and Henry Larch carefully positioned 2 sugar cubes beneath the upper wheel chalk, wedging them precisely as they had been found that morning. The wooden block rested on this improvised foundation with apparent stability, though Miss Marple noted that even the slightest pressure would cause the sugar to begin compressing under the weight. The timing of this mechanism, she explained as they worked, would depend on several factors: the rate of drip from the bottle above, the temperature and humidity of the morning air, and most importantly, the precise positioning of these sugar supports. As if summoned by her words, the first drops of milk began to fall from the punctured bottle, striking the uppermost sugar cube with a soft, rhythmic sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet dairy. The liquid spread slowly across the surface of the cube, beginning the process of dissolution that would ultimately trigger the deadly mechanism. Lady Bantry watched this demonstration with fascination tinged by horror. "How long would such a process take?" she inquired. "That," Miss Marple replied, "would have been something our killer could calculate with reasonable precision. Sugar cubes of standard size, exposed to a steady drip of liquid at normal room temperature, would begin to show significant weakening within 10 to 15 minutes. The assembled group watched in grim fascination as the sugar began to soften and compress under the dual pressure of the dripping milk and the weight of the wooden chalk. The process was gradual but inexorable, and Miss Marple noted that the timing could be adjusted by varying the size of the puncture in the inner foil or by using more or fewer sugar cubes as supports. Someone familiar with these materials and conditions, she continued, could predict quite accurately when the supports would fail. And if they knew Ben Larch's morning routine as well as I suspect our killer did, they could arrange for the mechanism to trigger at precisely the moment when he would be standing at the foot of the ramp. Inspector Slack examined the demonstration apparatus with growing appreciation for the murderer's cunning, but how could they be certain of the exact timing? Surely there would be variables that might affect when the sugar dissolved completely. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, there would be, which is why I suspect our killer conducted preliminary tests to perfect the mechanism. Notice how precisely the sugar cubes were positioned, not randomly placed, but carefully wedged to ensure maximum contact with the dripping liquid. As they watched, the sugar supports began to show visible signs of collapse. The cubes had become soft and sticky, and the wooden chalk was beginning to settle as its foundation weakened. Miss Marple pointed out how the dissolving sugar created a slippery track along the trestle rail exactly as they had observed at the scene of the crime. You see how the syrup guides the movement of the chalk. Once the supports fail completely, the wooden block will slide along this sugary path directly toward the release point. The demonstration was proceeding with mechanical precision when the sugar cubes finally gave way entirely. The wooden chalk slipped along the syrup-slicked rail with a sound that made everyone present think of the much larger churn that had followed the same path just hours before, with fatal consequences. Henry Larch watched this reconstruction of his son's murder with a mixture of admiration and revulsion. "It's diabolical," he said quietly, "to use such ordinary, innocent things, milk and sugar, as instruments of death." "But also brilliant," Miss Marple admitted. With a detached appreciation she might have shown for a particularly clever piece of needlework. "This is the work of someone who understood both the mechanical principles involved and the domestic properties of common materials. More importantly, it's the work of someone who knew the dairy's routines intimately." Figimar gestured toward the now empty clamp where the demonstration bottle had been positioned? Consider the knowledge required to construct such a device. The killer needed to understand how long milk would take to drip through a given size opening, how quickly sugar would dissolve under specific conditions, and most crucially, exactly when Ben Larch would be standing in the precise spot where the falling churn would strike him. The implications were sobering. This was not a crime of passion or sudden opportunity, but a calculated murder planned with meticulous attention to detail. The killer had transformed the familiar routines of dairy work into a weapon of remarkable precision, using their victim's own conscientiousness against him. A timer one can make in a village, Miss Marple concluded softly, echoing the rustic simplicity that had masked such sophisticated planning, using nothing more exotic than a milk bottle, some sugar cubes, and an intimate knowledge of one young man's habits. The demonstration had provided compelling proof of how the murder had been accomplished, but it had also revealed the cold calculation behind the crime. Someone had spent considerable time and effort perfecting a method that would allow them to kill while appearing to be safely elsewhere, and the precision of their success spoke to both intelligence and complete ruthlessness. Chapter 10. Dairy ramp, bottle, sugar, and a rolling churn. The morning sun had climbed high enough to cast sharp shadows across the dairy yard, where Miss Marple gathered the assembled company around the scene of Ben Larch's murder for her final exposition. Inspector Slack stood with his notebook at the ready, while Lady Bantry positioned herself where she could observe both Miss Marple and the various suspects who had been summoned to hear the solution to the crime. Violet Tanner had arrived with obvious reluctance, her sharp features drawn with anxiety that she attempted to disguise behind her usual air of commercial efficiency. She stood slightly apart from the others, her hands clasped tightly before her in a manner that suggested she was bracing herself for unpleasant revelations. "We have gathered here," Miss Marple began in her gentle but caring voice, "to examine a crime of remarkable sophistication, disguised as a simple accident. What appeared to be a tragic mishap caused by wetboards and careless handling has revealed itself to be a carefully planned murder using the most ordinary of domestic materials." She gestured toward the loading ramp where the morning's tragedy had unfolded. The means employed were elegantly simple. The killer positioned a half-pint bottle in the drying clamp above this ramp, but not in the innocent manner it first appeared. This bottle had been prepared with a double foil cap, an outer seal that appeared untouched, concealing an inner seal that had been precisely punctured with a pin. Miss Marple demonstrated once again how the recapping tool could be used to create this deception, noting how the technique required familiarity with dairy equipment that only someone with regular access to such tools would possess. Beneath the bottle, she continued, moving to the trestle where the churn had been positioned, the upper wheel chock was supported, not by its usual secure placement, but by sugar cubes strategically positioned to dissolve when exposed to liquid. As milk dripped slowly from the punctured bottle above, these supports gradually weakened until they could no longer bear the weight of the chock. The mechanical precision of the murder weapon was evident, as Miss Marple traced the path the wooden block would have followed once its supports failed. When the sugar finally gave way, the chalk slipped along a track made slippery by the dissolving sweetener, releasing the full weight of the 10-gallon churn to roll down the ramp at precisely the moment when Ben Larch would be conducting his morning inspection. Inspector Slack cleared his throat officiously. "That's all very well, Miss Marple, but proving how the crime was committed is only half the battle. We need to establish who had the means, motive, and opportunity to construct such a device." "Indeed we do," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "Let us examine each of these elements systematically. First, the means. This crime required access to dairy equipment, including the recapping tool necessary to create the double foil seal. It also required sugar cubes of the specific type used in commercial tea service, wrapped in blue paper rather than the plain brown strips used by the dairy itself. She turned to address Violet Tanner directly. Mrs. Tanner, you borrowed the recapping tool yesterday, ostensibly to repair some bottle caps for a window display. You also purchased sugar cubes from Mr. Sykes's grocery yesterday evening, an unusual time for such a purchase, according to his testimony. Violet's composure cracked slightly under Miss Marple's calm scrutiny. I needed the sugar for this morning's service, she said stiffly. There's nothing suspicious about purchasing supplies for one's business. Nothing suspicious in itself, Miss Marple agreed. But when combined with other evidence, it forms part of a damning pattern. You see, the motive for this crime lay in the systematic fraud you had been perpetrating against Meadow Dairy. The explanation that followed laid bare the extent of Violet Tanner's deception. The watering down of milk, the addition of sugar to mask the dilution, the corruption of May Read to falsify lactometer readings, all had been part of an elaborate scheme to defraud the dairy while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business. Ben. Larch had discovered your activities, Miss Marple continued remorselessly. His notebook contains evidence of his suspicions, and May Read has confirmed that he intended to confront you this morning about the thin cream returns. Exposure would have meant not only the end of your fraudulent scheme, but likely criminal charges, and the ruin of your tea-room business. Henry Larch listened to this exposition with growing anger and grief. You killed my son to protect your miserable little swindle, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Violet's mask of composure finally slipped entirely. I never meant for anyone to die, she said desperately. I only intended to delay him, to give myself time to speak with you privately about the situation. The mechanism was supposed to create a minor accident that would prevent Ben from making his rounds this morning. But you positioned the timing device to strike at the exact moment of Ben's morning inspection, Miss Marple pointed out with inexorable logic. You knew his routines because you had observed them during your visits to the dairy. You calculated the timing to ensure the churn would fall when he was standing in precisely the right position to be struck. The confession, when it came, was delivered in a voice barely above a whisper. Violet Tanner admitted to constructing the murder weapon, to setting it in motion during her early morning visit to receive cake deliveries, and to establishing her alibi by ensuring she was seen unlocking her tea room at the crucial time. The alibi was carefully constructed, Miss Marple observed. You needed to be seen at your own establishment during the crucial period, but you also needed time to set the mechanism in motion. By claiming an early delivery that never actually materialized, you created a legitimate reason to be up and about, while also providing yourself with the opportunity to visit the dairy unobserved, Inspector. Slack stepped forward with the grim satisfaction of a man whose case had been thoroughly proven. Violet Tanner, I arrest you for the willful murder of Benjamin Larch. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be used in evidence against you. As the formalities of arrest proceeded, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the domestic nature of the crime. The killer had used the most innocent of materials, milk, sugar, and the familiar tools of dairy work, to create a weapon of lethal precision. It was a reminder that evil could lurk behind the most ordinary facades, using the comfortable routines of village life to mask the darkest of intentions. Later, as the dairy yard began to empty and the machinery of justice took its course, Lady Bantry stood beside the quiet loading ramp where the tragedy had unfolded. Milk and sugar, she mused. Who would have thought such innocent things could be turned to murder? Miss Marple folded her knitting with the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice served. It is the domestic things. My dear Dolly, she replied thoughtfully. Milk rings on slate, sugar wrappers in bottle crates, and the way a foil cap is pressed. Those small details don't lie, even when people do. The truth has a way of revealing itself through the most ordinary of evidence, if one simply knows how to look. The morning that had begun with such terrible tragedy was ending with the satisfaction of mystery solved and justice served. Ben Larch's murder had been avenged, and the dairy that bore his family's name could begin the slow process of healing from the betrayal that had cost a young man his life.